Long before mankind dreamed of the stars, before the Eldar carved their empire across the heavens, before even the birth of the Chaos Gods as we know them, there was another age, the War in Heaven. It was a conflict so ancient that even the most venerable of the Eldar's Farseers speak of it only in whispers, and human records are but shadows of myth. It was the war between the Old Ones, masters of life and the warp, and their most tragic creation, the Necron tier, cursed with frailty, who became the Necrons. The Necrons, soulless machines of living metal, forged by biotransference and led by the Silent King, had turned upon their creators and waged a war that scarred the galaxy forever. The Old Ones fell, the warp was reshaped, and in the end, the Necrons too retreated into their tombs. Exhausted, diminished, but undefeated, they entombed themselves beneath countless worlds, waiting for the galaxy to ripen once more. In canon history, that awakening would not come until the 41st millennium. But what if it had come early? What if, as the Great Crusade blazed across the galaxy, the tombs stirred, and the Necrons awoke centuries too soon? At first, the awakening is imperceptible. Deep beneath dead worlds, the flicker of stasis crypts reignites. In silent vaults untouched for 60 million years, eyes of emerald fire open. Legions of warriors stir as the ancient command protocols ripple through the tombs. Pylons, silent for eons, hum with energy once again. Entire planets begin to shift, their cores resonating with technologies older than any star chart. In the void between galaxies, the Silent King himself stirs. He has wandered the intergalactic dark, cursed by regret, haunted by the choice to entomb his people. He has watched the galaxy change, felt the rise of new species, sensed the birth of chaos gods as mortal emotions swelled in the warp. In the 41st millennium, his return was calculated. But in this timeline, something accelerates his decision. Perhaps it is the rise of humanity, whose sudden empire grows faster than any he has ever witnessed. Perhaps it is the awakening of too many tombs at once, their protocols resonating like a beacon. Or perhaps it is simply inevitability. Whatever the cause, the Silent King turns his gaze back to the galaxy, and he decides the time has come. The first dynasties awaken on the galactic fringe. Entire continents shatter as tomb complexes rise, black monoliths piercing the skies. Emerald lightning crackles as Gauss weapons hum for the first time in eons. Cities of the living are obliterated in moments, their populations reduced to ash and bone before they can even scream. Imperial settlers vanish, their colonies erased so cleanly that later expeditions believe the planet's barren. At first, the Imperium does not notice. The Great Crusade consumes countless resources, spanning thousands of worlds. Lost colonies are not unusual. Unexplained silences are not uncommon. To most commanders, the reports of metallic warriors are dismissed as Xenos hysteria, local legends dressed in superstition. But the truth spreads. The first confirmed encounter comes on the frontier world of Holossis. The planet's defenders, a regiment of Imperial army and a garrison of Astartes, report an invasion not from the sky, but from beneath. Metallic warriors rose from the sands, weapons of emerald fire reducing tanks to molten slag, infantry to scattered atoms. Bolters proved useless, plasma scorched but did not kill. Even when hacked apart, the warriors reformed, their bodies stitching themselves together with unnatural speed. The battle lasted 3 days. On the 4th, there was silence. The next Imperial fleet to arrive found nothing but ruins and a single Vox recording, a Space Marine's last words broken by static. "They do not tire, they do not fall. Emperor, protect us." The recording ends with a crack of emerald lightning. Panic ripples through the higher councils of the Imperium. Reports multiply, tomb worlds awakening in conquered systems, populations erased, entire fleets vanishing without a trace. For the first time, the Primarchs hear whispers of an enemy unlike any they have ever faced. The Emperor listens, his expression unreadable. In his heart, he recognizes something familiar. In his long, secret life, he has seen remnants of the war in heaven, felt the scars it left upon reality. He knows the truth. These are not new enemies. They are ancient ones. And if they have awakened early, the galaxy stands upon the brink of a darkness no mortal empire can resist. The Silent King surveys his awakening empire. Dynasty after dynasty answers his call. The Sotek, disciplined and ruthless. The Nyalach, proud and calculating. The Maynarch, twisted and cruel. He does not seek open war, not yet. His purpose is reclamation, to purge infestations, to reclaim the galaxy that was once his people's. And yet he studies humanity. Their rise is startling. In only a few centuries, they have spread across the stars with fire and steel. They have created warriors who rival demigods, weapons that wound even his legions. They are not the Eldar, decadent and fading. They are not the Orcs, crude and mindless. They are something new, something dangerous. The Silent King ponders. Should humanity be crushed now, before it can grow stronger? Or should it be studied, harvested, perhaps even shaped into tools of Necron dominion? For the first time in eons, he hesitates. But his dynasties do not hesitate. They awaken with hunger, and hunger drives them to war. Entire sectors vanish into silence. Human colonies disappear. Eldar craftworlds, once predators, now flee in terror at the sight of ancient ships rising from tomb worlds. Orc warbands charge into battle, only to find their fury dissolved in Gauss fire, their crude machines stripped atom by atom. Even chaos stirs uneasily, for the warp ripples strangely around the Necrons, their soulless existence denying the corruption that feeds the gods. For the first time in eons, he hesitates. But his dynasties do not hesitate. They awaken with hunger, and hunger drives them to war. Entire sectors vanish into silence. Human colonies disappear. Eldar craftworlds, once predators, now flee in terror at the sight of ancient ships rising from tomb worlds. Orc warbands charge into battle, only to find their fury dissolved in Gauss fire, their crude machines stripped atom by atom. Even chaos stirs uneasily, for the warp ripples strangely around the Necrons, their soulless existence denying the corruption that feeds the gods. The galaxy has changed. The long sleep has ended. The dead do not rest, they rise. This is the silent awakening, and it is only the beginning. The Imperium was still young enough to believe in inevitability. Terra had been hammered into unity, Mars bound to the throne by oath and engine. Expeditionary fleets fanned out like sparks caught by a galactic wind, each bearing a fragment of the master of mankind's will. The Primarchs, found one by one, were turning scattered human lights into constellations. In mess halls and strategiums, the talk was of how quickly the map would be filled with Imperial gold, how soon the last Xenos banners would be folded and burned. Then the reports from the fringe began to arrive, late, broken, and wrong. At first, they were filed where all strange things went, under unknown Xenos contact. A frontier agrimoon that shrieked once on astropathic channels and then fell permanently silent. A mining world whose crust opened like a jaw and swallowed its own cities. A ring of beacon boys that began blinking in perfect, unnatural synchrony, as if counting down to something only they could hear. Vox officers chalked it up to warp squalls, raiders, bad luck. Commanders who had survived the Rangdan, the Hrud migrations, and the Greenskin empires wanted clean signatures, mass readings, heat blooms, drive wakes. Instead, they got void black silhouettes that ate Auspex returns and left only the echo of their passage, like fingerprints pressed into empty air. The first fleet to truly see the enemy did not survive long enough to send anything back except a single, stuttering pict capture, a sky ribbed with emerald lightning, and a tide of metallic figures marching through falling ash. The file was stamped artifact, tucked into a sealed archive, and for a few more months the Crusade pretended the galaxy would remain the same. It did not. Malkador took to moving silently through the halls of the Imperial Palace, a stack of thin data slates under one arm. He did not need to announce the pattern to the Emperor. It lay in the gaps between tragedies. Settlements erased with surgical neatness. No survivors, no salvage. Garrisoned moons reduced to perfect circles of vitrified glass. Void forts that died with their shields at full strength, their reactors still humming for hours after their crews had been turned to powder. The Emperor listened and gave very few orders. One of them reached Mars as a sealed transmission, a directive to the Fabricator General to collate all pre-Unity references to Noctilith, null pylons, and star tombs. Another went to the Librarius Project. Suspend experiments in null zones. Redefine safe proximity around newly charted monolith sites, and brace the psychers for pain. The pain came swiftly. On Alphid Enea, 1,000 Suns strike cadre dropped to investigate a dead city whose streets were linted with metallic dust. The librarians felt the null tide first, like teeth closing around their minds. Runes guttered out, wards failed, auras went thin as paper. They pushed on anyway, and the first volley of emerald fire took them at the edge of a plaza scribed with geometric cuts that still bled heat from somewhere below. Bolters answered and did nothing. When the survivors teleported out, their war plates screamed with fused scars that would not heal, and their astroplath wept blood that formed perfect hexagons on the deck. Magnus read the reports with a hand pressed to his temple. "They are not of the warp," he said to no one in particular, and the statement was both answer and indictment. An enemy that did not drink from the same ocean as humanity's nightmares could not be poisoned by the usual remedies. Horus's 63rd Expeditionary Fleet reached the Halcyon Verge, expecting another compliance, the last of a string that had moved so quickly his logisticians were still stamping the seals. Instead, he found the husk of a world turned inward, continental plates pulled into spirals like shavings peeled from an apple. The pict feeds showed sculptures of green light rising and falling across the horizon, the shadows of things marching between them in ranks too straight to be living. Unknown, the remembrances whispered, and then went very quiet. Horus went down anyway. The lunar wolves hit dirt with the certainty that had carried them through 100 perfect assaults, and for the first time that certainty broke. The enemy did not flinch or roar or flee. It did not issue challenges or hold lines. It advanced as if obeying the command of a metronome. Every shot that punched through a chest re-knit itself in a hiss of heat. Every severed limb crawled home on filaments of light and fused again. When the captain of the first company cracked a warrior in half with a chain fist, its two pieces slithered together and rose in one motion, unhurried, unafraid. Horus pulled his sons back with a snarl and lived. He did not like the taste of that retreat, and he liked even less the brief flicker of something like surprise he felt from the presence that was his father when he reported in. On the other side of the Crusade's arc, the Ultramarines learned a different lesson. Robitaille Guilliman had a gift for turning victory into permanence, but the First World he took back from the Metallic Legions refused permanence of any kind. He garrisoned, he fortified, he established supply lines so regular their timetables could be sung. When the enemy returned, it did so beneath those schedules, stepping out of buried vaults far inside his security cordon, turning his command posts to silent sculptures of glass and bone. He tightened the net. They went deeper. He put eyes in every tunnel, auspex in every sewer. They stopped using tunnels and instead walked through walls as if they were smoke. Guilliman did not retreat. He learned. For every repetition in their pattern, he wrote a countermeasure. For every countermeasure, the enemy wrote an answer of its own. He sent those notes to Terra, where Malcador read them with the same stillness as a man feeling rain on his face and knowing it presages a flood. Rogel Dawn simply took the blow and set his jaw harder. He had made forts that laughed at macro shells. The first time a Necron war host stepped through the curtain of his shields like men stepping through a waterfall, Dawn changed nothing in his face. But his engineers noticed his next designs all had deeper roots and stranger angles. He never called them pylons, but the cores of those bastions hummed with a sound that made librarians nauseous. Leman Russ tried something else. He went hunting. The space wolves were born to run down prey that thought it could hide. The first time they tracked a retreating Necron cohort into the Badlands of Vire, they howled into a sun-eaten canyon and found a tomb door yawning, the air beyond it cold enough to frost the teeth in their mouths. Russ spat, grinned, and went in at the head of his pack. They fought for 3 days in echoing corridors lined with machinery older than Terra's first city. And when they came back out, they had the heads of a dozen things that should not have been able to die at all. The heads reassembled on the sand while the wolves watched, the green glow knitting bones that were not bones back into skulls that were not skulls, and the pack's laughter went very quiet. On Mars, red priests leaned close over captured shards and whispered in awe. Here was metal that remembered its shape no matter how you broke it. Here was energy that cut not by heat, but by unmaking. Here was the geometry that the oldest Mechanicum's prayer cants hinted at, but never taught. On Mars, red priests leaned close over captured shards and whispered in awe. Here was metal that remembered its shape, no matter how you broke it. Here was energy that cut not by heat, but by unmaking. Here was the geometry that the oldest Mechanicum prayer cants hinted at, but never taught. Words like necrodermis and phase realignment began to appear in sealed treatises, followed by sketches of blades that could be made to hum to the same song, shields that might drink light instead of reflecting it. The Fabricator General sent a message to Terra that was half plea, half confession. We can learn from this, but the learning may change us. The Emperor's return message was as brief as a blade. Do not let it change you. Several Magi never saw that reply. They were already on ships bound for dead moons, intent on prying up monoliths with graph hooks and contempt. Those ships did not return. Their last transmissions were static, etched with neat, unnatural squares. Elsewhere, the Eldar remembered. There are some terrors that do not fade, even when sung for 10,000 years. The war in heaven lived in the bones of their oldest seers like cold lives in old wounds. When the first craft world saw the emerald-limbed silhouettes rising on a horizon of black glass, it turned and fled without firing a shot. Other Eldar called them cowards. The Farseers called it wisdom. In hidden councils they argued the numbers. Some said the Necrons were waking in fragments, manageable, survivable. Others shook their heads. The enemy that had once unmade suns did not need to wake everywhere to end everything. It only needed to wake in the right places and wait for everyone else to panic. One Farseer, old even by their standards, her voice thin as paper, said softly, "We must warn the humans." The room laughed until they saw that she did not. They warned them anyway. A single message passed through a webway gate into an Imperial relay. Your fires draw the hunters. Do not strike the stones with hammers. You cannot break what is older than you. An Imperial censor flagged it as Eldar misdirection and deleted it with a sigh of duty done well. Psychers across the Crusade began to wake from the same dream. A corridor that did not end, lined with statues whose eyes were bright green and empty of all expression. Some awoke screaming from the sensation of being measured and then marked insufficient. Others could no longer hear the sea of the warp at all when Necron artifacts were near. The Librarius program was designed to risk, but the risks had always been storms they knew. The Maelstrom, the Predator, the Whisper. This was not a storm. This was absence. Magnus issued new protocols, not because he believed caution would save them, but because he needed time to think. He sat in a circle of chalk and gold and tried to read futures that grew narrower by the hour. And for the first time since Prospero, he felt something very close to fear. An enemy that does not dream, he said to Aemon. What leverage do we have over a thing that has no fear of damnation, no lust for glory, no desire at all? Only its purpose, Aemon answered, and Magnus hated that it made sense. A creature without hunger could only be moved by design. When the Emperor assembled a closed council on Terra, it was a short list. Horus for his instinct, Guilliman for his logistics, Dawn for his stone, Magnus for his understanding of what this was not, Malcador to weigh all the edges. The map that burned before them was marked not with enemy icons, but with absences, holes where signals should have been, clean circles where whole populations had been. The silence itself had become the Necrons' banner. We cannot fight them as we fight the greenskins, Horus said. They will not break upon our charge. We hit them, and they simply continue. Then we fortify, Dawn said. Fix the front, find the vaults, starve them of access. They do not eat, brother, Magnus murmured. Then starve them of time, Guilliman said. Contain, cordon, triage. We will need to redefine victory. Survival is a victory. A line we can hold is a victory. A retreat we control is a victory. Malcador said nothing. The Emperor's eyes were on the map, and for a moment his expression softened into something almost like memory and almost like regret. Send word to the Mechanicum, he said at last. We will need counterfields. And send word to every fleet. Do not pursue beneath the ground. If you find a tomb, collapse it from orbit and mark the system black. Russ would ignore that order somewhere, Magnus thought. He did not smile. On 100 worlds, ordinary people learned to listen for a hum that wasn't there yesterday. Administratum clerks began adding a new column to planetary ledgers. Monolith sighted? Yes. Agriserfs whispered that the ground had started breathing. Astropaths on whole routes went mute mid-message and never spoke again. Somewhere in a manufacturum, a remembrancer began painting nothing but green light on black canvas and did not know why. And still, the crusade pushed outward. It had to. To stand still was to admit that the dream had begun to end. The Primarchs wrote new doctrines in the ash. Guilliman's defensive grids, Dawn's depth bastions, Horus's hit and fade strikes aimed not at cohorts, but at the relay structures that seemed to call them. Vulcan's rescue routes that carved corridors for refugees through killing zones of emerald fire. Even Mortorian learned, dragging his Death Guard through storms of particles that stripped the first layers of paint from their armor and kept going, teaching himself to fight an enemy he could not choke. For the first time in living memory, the Imperium had encountered a foe that did not care if it was hated. It did not want terror, worship, surrender, or surrender's theater. It wanted the galaxy back the way it remembered it. And far beyond any charted edge, the Silent King watched the patterns form. Humanity surprised him. Adaptable, coordinated, terrifyingly willing to throw bodies upon a problem until the problem dulled its blades. He adjusted the cadence of awakenings by a fractional margin, and whole sectors died more quietly than they had before. He did not hate them. He had outlived hate. But he recognized a danger that might, if left to ripen, threaten even his purpose. So he wrote a new line into his design.
Cull, measure, proceed. The Great Crusade, which had believed itself the tide, felt the undertow. And somewhere in the dark between stars, something vast and hungry that had been watching mankind with interest turned its many minds toward other prey. The silence was not just killing worlds, it was thinning the taste of the warp itself. Humanity had never been more numerous. It had also never felt so small. It began with a silence deeper than any void. The 27th Expeditionary Fleet, under the banners of the Iron Hands, translated into the Clonlon Reach, expecting resistance. Perhaps a stubborn Xenos enclave or scattered human holdouts that would require a compliance action. What they found was a star system gone pale, its worlds stripped bare, its moons cracked like eggshells. At first, they assumed it had been orcs or some unknown catastrophe, but when their sensors pierced the void, they saw the shapes. Vast structures of impossible geometry, black as the spaces between stars, drifting in orbits too precise for chance. Ferrus Manus gave the order to descend. His legion, renowned for their pragmatism and strength, made landfall on the world that once bore the name Jerick 4. It was a barren place now, its oceans boiled away, its cities reduced to neat lines of glass. At first, nothing stirred. The iron hands advanced with machine precision, their bolters tight in their grips, their armor shining beneath the hollow sun. They thought the world abandoned, another corpse to be catalogued.
Then the ground beneath them split apart, like a mouth opening to speak, and from it poured the legions of the Necrons. They came in silence, their eyes burning with emerald light, their weapons humming with unholy resonance. The first volley stripped an entire squad of Astartes to dust, their armor crumbling around bones that dissolved into ash. Bolters answered with fury, tearing chunks from metal torsos, yet the warriors did not fall. Their bodies reformed, their wounds sealing with living silver. Ferrus himself charged, his hammer cracking one into fragments. He turned to issue his orders, but the fragments crawled back together at his feet, rising unbroken. The iron hands fought harder, their discipline unyielding, their rage machine-like. But the Necrons did not falter. They did not panic. They simply advanced, one step at a time, an ocean of inevitability. 3 companies were lost in minutes. Entire armored cohorts melted to slag under the green fire of Gauss weapons. Titans strode into the fray, their void shields shimmering brilliantly, and then collapsing in silence as their reactors were stripped apart, atom by atom. For the first time in their history, the Iron Hands retreated. The survivors fought their way back to orbit, their ships launching bombardments that scorched the surface into glass once more. For hours, they rained fire until their magazines were nearly dry. Only then did the enemy stop advancing. When the dust cleared, the picked feeds showed the truth. The Necrons had simply withdrawn back into their tombs, leaving no corpses, no debris, nothing but the scarred surface of Jerick 4.
The battle had not been won or lost. It had been endured. Ferrus Manus, grim even by his own standards, made his report to Terra. His words were as hard as iron. This is not a foe of flesh. This is not a foe of will. They cannot be cowed, nor broken, nor reasoned with. Their purpose is written in their nature, and their nature is extinction. If we are to survive, we must become as unyielding as they. The Emperor listened, silent as always. Malcador stood beside him, his face pale. They both understood what the report meant. For the first time, the Imperium had found an enemy it could not conquer with faith, fire, or force of arms. Meanwhile, across the stars, other fleets were encountering the same truth. The Imperial fists lost a fortress moon when its bastions were bypassed as though they were mist. The White Scars pursued raiders across a dead desert, only to find themselves surrounded by phalanxes that had been waiting beneath the sand. The Ultramarines lost 3 entire colonies, their governor's final vox logs nothing but whispers of green light and silence. The Astartes were not alone in their struggle. The Imperial army fared even worse. Entire regiments disappeared, their last stands erased so cleanly that administratum clerks were forced to mark their records expunged, not deceased. The orcs who clashed with the Necrons roared into battle and were reduced to slag, their war cries drowned in silence. The Eldar, too, began to panic, abandoning whole sectors rather than confront the enemy of their most ancient nightmares.
But it was the Psykers who suffered most. On battlefields where the Necrons marched, the warp screamed. Astropaths clawed at their eyes, their souls collapsing into nothingness. Battle Psykers found their powers flickering out, their connection to the warp severed as if strangled. The enemy did not simply resist psychic assault, they denied it, silencing the warp itself. To Magnus and his 1,000 sons, this was a revelation more terrible than any daemon. Here was a foe immune to corruption, to temptation, to the very fabric of chaos. The Imperium had faced horrors before, the Orcs with their endless brutality, the Eldar with their cunning, the Rangdan with their apocalyptic fury. But all of them could be fought, defeated, ground down with sufficient will. The Necrons were different. They could not be tempted because they had no souls. They could not be intimidated because they felt no fear. They could not exhausted because they did not tire. The first contact was not a war, it was a lesson, and the lesson was simple. The Imperium was no longer the greatest power in the galaxy. The Eldar had always spoken of themselves as the heirs of eternity. Even diminished, even scattered to their craft worlds, they still carried the pride of an empire that had once spanned the galaxy. They had fought mankind with disdain, trading barbs of steel and psychic fire, confident in their ancient mastery of the stars. But when the first whispers came that the Necrons had stirred, pride turned to terror. The oldest of the Farseers had known this moment would come. They had seen it in fractured visions, in strands of fate so dark they dared not share them, even with their kin. They remembered the war in heaven, not as myth or rumor, but as scars woven into their very souls. Their ancestors had fought the Necrontar, had seen them trade flesh for living metal, had witnessed the birth of soulless warriors who could not die. The Eldar had seen suns extinguished, whole constellations silenced by the Necrons' will. That memory never left them. Now, when the tombs began to stir, the Farseers wept. On Craftworld Ulthway, seer councils convened in desperate secrecy. Some argued that the Necrons were still weak, that they woke in fragments, manageable in number. Others argued that it did not matter. Even a fraction of their strength could unravel the balance of the galaxy. The younger warlocks, bold and arrogant, clamored for battle. The elders silenced them with a single word: memory. It was memory that guided their decisions now. The Eldar remembered the war in heaven, and they knew. The Imperium did not. Humanity, arrogant in its new power, could not understand what was coming. The Farseers debated whether to warn them. To reveal the truth was to admit the Eldar's weakness. To remain silent was to risk the extinction of the galaxy itself. On Iyanden, the dead began to stir. Spirit seers walked the infinity circuit with trembling hands, calling forth ancient souls that had fought this war before. Wraithguard and Wraith Lords rose from their tombs, their spirits whispering in horror at the old enemy's return. Some refused to fight, begging to be returned to slumber rather than face the Necrons again. But Iyanden could not afford refusal. The dead would fight, whether they willed it or not. Elsewhere, more desperate measures were taken. Some craftworlds simply fled. At the first sign of Necron awakening, they abandoned their colonies, their allies, even their own kind. Entire fleets of Eldar vanished into the webway, refusing to risk open conflict. To some, it seemed cowardice. To those who remembered, it was survival. For even the mighty Asuryani had no confidence in victory. The Dark Eldar, too, felt the change. In the depths of Komarok, Cabals paused their eternal games of cruelty as reports filtered in. Slaves and spies spoke of metallic warriors who could not feel pain, who could not scream, who could not bleed. The Dark Eldar thrived on suffering, but the Necrons offered nothing. For the first time in their decadent history, the Cabals tasted fear, not of pain, but of silence. The laughter in Comarag faltered. Some among the Harlequins danced the tale of the war in heaven, masks twisted in anguish as they reenacted the slaughter of the Old Ones. Their plays, once riddles to be puzzled over, became warnings. They whispered to craft-worlds and cabals alike, the great enemy is not the warp alone. There is another, and it walks again. When the Eldar finally approached the Imperium, their warnings were dismissed. An encrypted message carried through the webway reached an Imperial relay station. It read, "Your fires draw the hunters. Do not strike the stones with hammers. You cannot break what is older than you." Administratum clerks flagged it as Eldar deception and deleted it. The Imperium, drunk on conquest, had no patience for prophecies from a dying race. So the Eldar stood alone in their knowledge. They watched humanity crash against the Necrons as children running into the sea, thinking themselves masters of the tide. And they prepared, not for victory, but for survival. Craftworlds shifted course. Old alliances were whispered of in council chambers. Some even considered the unthinkable, speaking to the Emperor directly, not as rival, but as ally. But the galaxy was vast, and time was short. For every tomb world that stirred, for every monolith that rose, for every green light that flickered against the stars, the Eldar felt the noose tighten. Their people were already dwindling. They could not withstand another war like the war in heaven. And yet it was here, once more. They were not ready. No one was. The Eldar, proud children of the stars, looked upon the awakening and knew despair. The Great Crusade had been a storm without equal. From Terra, fleets had swept across the galaxy like wildfire, thousands of worlds falling beneath the banners of the Aquila. The Primarchs, radiant demigods at the head of their legions, had made conquest seem inevitable. Each victory fed the next, each compliance fueling the dream of a galaxy united under one law, one emperor, one truth. But storms burned themselves out. When the Necrons awakened, the crusade did not stop immediately. At first, the Imperium pressed on, confident in its momentum. Tomb worlds were purged with fire. Monoliths were shattered under orbital bombardment. Primarchs led their sons with unmatched fury, determined to prove that this enemy was no different from any other. And yet, the enemy remained. The first sign of strain came not on the battlefield, but in the ledger books of the Administratum. Campaigns that had once lasted months now dragged into years. Fleets that had once swept through sectors found themselves mired in endless defenses, chasing an enemy that refused to stay dead. Colonies meant to resupply Crusade fleets fell silent, their populations erased. Whole regions of the map grew dark, marked not with the banners of conquest, but with question marks and silence. The Ultramarines, masters of order, began to falter. Guilliman's meticulous plans were undone by Necron precision. Where he built supply chains, the Necrons struck at the heart, collapsing his networks in an instant. Where he fortified, the Necrons phased through walls as if they were smoke. Guilliman adapted, as he always did, but each adaptation bought him only time. His reports to Terra grew colder, stripped of optimism. Victory was no longer assumed. Survival had become the measure of success. The Imperial fists, unyielding as stone, faced humiliation. Their bastions, designed to weather any siege, were undone from within. Shields that should have lasted weeks failed in minutes. Walls that had stood against orc war machines crumbled under weapons that unmade matter itself. Rogel Dawn fought with stoic determination, but in private even he admitted the truth to Malkador. Stone is meaningless against this foe. We are defending against the collapse of reality itself. The Space Wolves, born for the hunt, found themselves prey. Layman Russ pursued Necron cohorts into tombs, seeking to destroy them at the source, only to find himself trapped in labyrinths that shifted like mazes alive. His packs howled in defiance, their ferocity unmatched, but the enemy was not afraid, could not be afraid. For every wolf that tore apart a warrior, another rose in its place, unbroken, unfeeling. Russ dragged his sons out alive by sheer force of will, but his rage burned like wildfire. "We fight shadows," he snarled, "and shadows cannot bleed." The Thousand Sons, so often the Emperor's blade against the mysteries of the warp, were undone. Magnus, proud and brilliant, reached into the Imperium to strike, and found silence. His psychic might, once unmatched, flickered and guttered in the presence of the Necrons. Their null field swallowed sorcery whole, leaving his sons helpless. For Magnus, it was a wound deeper than the battlefield. To be powerless was unthinkable, and yet, before the Necrons, he was reduced to silence. Elsewhere, the legions fared no better. Vulcan, master of craft, watched his finest creations dissolved to ash in seconds. Mortarion, immune to plague, found no satisfaction in fighting an enemy that could not rot. Perturabo, master of sieges, faced fortresses within fortresses, puzzles of geometry older than mankind itself. Even Horus, the War Master, the beloved son whose charisma bound the legions together, faced battles that ended not in triumph, but in retreat. His words, once unshakable, began to falter. "We are not conquering," he admitted to his captains. "We are surviving." The Emperor did not waver. He never wavered. But even he could not mask the truth from his sons. The Great Crusade had stalled. Its tide had met a wall, and the wall was unyielding. For every victory won, 10 were lost. For every tomb destroyed, another stirred in silence. For the first time since the Crusade began, the map of the Empire no longer expanded. It shrank. On Terra, the Administratum began issuing new edicts. Systems marked for compliance were abandoned. Colonies were redirected to fortify rather than expand. On Terra, the Administratum began issuing new edicts. Systems marked for compliance were abandoned. Colonies were redirected to fortify rather than expand. Recruitment quotas doubled, then tripled. Forge worlds groaned beneath the demand for war machines that would last mere hours against Necron fire. The dream of a unified galaxy was slipping away, replaced by a grim reality. The Imperium was fighting for survival before it had even been born. The orcs laughed and hurled themselves at the Necrons, their wargs burning bright and short. The Eldar withdrew further, their warnings ignored. Even Chaos, watching from the warp, stirred uneasily. The gods hungered for souls, for corruption, for war, but the Necrons offered nothing. Where they marched, the warp grew silent, starved. And so the Great Crusade stalled. The storm that had swept across the galaxy was reduced to scattered lightning, striking desperately, flaring bright, then vanishing into darkness. Humanity, which had believed itself inevitable, now tasted doubt. For the first time, the Imperium looked into the abyss and saw not victory, not destiny, but silence. far beyond the front lines, past the wars that burned in silence and green fire, the true architect of the awakening stirred. The silent king, Zarek, had slumbered longer than any mortal mind could imagine. He had watched the galaxy from the void beyond its edge, wandering in exile, haunted by the choice that had damned his people to eternal undeath. In another age, he would have returned in the 41st millennium, awakened by the hunger of dynasties and the shifting tides of fate. But here, now, the galaxy's turmoil roused him too soon.
The Great Crusade's relentless march, its conquests echoing across the stars, drew his gaze. Humanity had risen faster than any race before it. In mere centuries, they had spread across thousands of worlds, united under a single banner. The Emperor's design, though Sarek did not know its full depths, was visible even from the void. Order imposed with ruthless efficiency, a tide that drowned all before it. The Silent King considered this with the cold calculation of one who had outlived hope. He had not returned to the galaxy to seek vengeance or triumph. He had returned because his people demanded it, because their tombs could not slumber forever, because their hunger for reclamation was inevitable. And now humanity complicated that inevitability. To the Silent King, the question was not if humanity should be opposed, it was how. The Eldar, he remembered, had once been the greatest rivals of the Necrons. They had fought at the side of the Old Ones, wielding the Imperium as a blade. In those days, they had been dangerous, their mastery of the warp nearly overwhelming. But now they were diminished, their empire cracked and fading. The Necrons could deal with them as they always had, with fire and silence. But humanity was different. They were crude, yes, compared to the Eldar. Their empire was new, their gods still forming, their grasp of the warp clumsy. Yet their potential was undeniable. The Primarchs, their demigod generals, were beings the Silent King could not ignore. They were not as refined as the Satan had been, but their presence altered the balance of the galaxy. If mankind were allowed to grow unchecked, they might become the one foe even the Necrons could not extinguish. And so Zarek considered his strategy. The Necrons did not wage war as others did. They had no need for glory, no hunger for conquest. They calculated, they culled, they reclaimed. His dynasties, already stirring, hungered for total war, but the Silent King restrained them. Total war was wasteful. Humanity was strong enough to resist for now, but not yet mature enough to be dangerous. Better to bleed them slowly, to sap their strength, to let them fracture under the weight of their own ambition. He ordered the dynasties to awaken in waves, not all at once. A sector here, a tomb world there. Enough to spread terror, enough to grind the Great Crusade to a halt, but not enough to provoke unity. He wanted humanity to see the Necrons as inevitable, unstoppable, not in one great blow, but in 1,000 cuts. He wanted them to fight, to waste themselves, to lose their faith in victory. And yet, within the stillness of his mind, the Silent King hesitated. There was something about humanity that unsettled him. They were reckless, yes, but they were adaptable. They were brutal, but also cunning. Unlike the Elder, whose pride had blinded them, humanity seemed willing to sacrifice anything for survival. Even now, in the face of the Necrons' awakening, they were not breaking. They were bending,
shifting, rewriting themselves to meet the threat. That resilience was dangerous. It reminded him bitterly of his own people before the biotransference, weak, fragile, dying, but unwilling to surrender. Perhaps humanity could not be harvested as easily as he wished. Perhaps they would require more decisive action. The Silent King issued new orders. Necron forces would not simply annihilate Imperial colonies. They would test them, measure their resilience, record their responses. A war not of conquest, but of data. Every battle was an experiment. Every defeat humanity suffered was a note in the Necrons' endless ledger. And the results, as they filtered back through the command protocols of the dynasties, fascinated him. Humanity fought like no other. They threw bodies at impossible odds. They sacrificed fleets to buy a single hour. They rebuilt what was destroyed with stubborn speed. They adapted to technologies they barely understood, crafting countermeasures against weapons they could not explain. For every world that died, another rose. For every legion broken, another reformed. The Silent King watched, and for the first time in eons, he felt something almost like unease. The Necrons had faced mighty foes before. They had faced the Old Ones, masters of life, who wielded the warp like a scalpel. They had faced the Eldar at their height, with their empire spanning the stars. But humanity was different. They did not wield the warp with skill, nor did they command an empire of refinement. Their strength was something else, something dangerous. Defiance. And yet, he would not change his plan. Humanity would bleed. Their primarchs would burn themselves against the walls of Necron tombs. Their emperor, brilliant though he was, could not fight everywhere at once. The Imperium would fracture, and when it did, the Necrons would reclaim what was theirs. Still, in the depths of his silence, the Silent King acknowledged a truth he did not share with his subjects. If mankind survived long enough, if they endured the crucible of this early awakening, they might one day become something the Necrons could not overcome. It was a risk he could not allow. In the Imperium, where thought is flesh and desire is godhood, the great powers stirred uneasily. The warp had always fed on mortals. Every scream, every prayer, every ambition was fuel. The rise of humanity had been a feast, billions of souls pouring into the Imperium, birthing gods of blood, rot, trickery, and excess. The long war of chaos was eternal, its victories measured in corruption and despair. But with the Necrons' awakening, the banquet began to wither. For the first time in eons, the warp grew quiet. Where Necron legions marched, there were no souls to claim. Their warriors were husks, bodies of living metal, minds reduced to code and protocol. When they killed, they did not kill with hate or joy or desperation. They simply erased. And erasure fed nothing. A battlefield where mortals fought was a feast. A battlefield where Necrons fought was barren. The warp shivered at the silence. Khorne raged first. The blood god had swelled with humanity's wars, each slain feeding his endless throne of skulls. But the Necrons denied him. Their battles were not fought in anger. Their killings were not done in wrath. To slay without fury was to deny Khorne his due. For every war host reduced to ash by Gauss fire, for every legion atomized without passion, the flow of blood slowed. The great throne rattled as Khorne bellowed his hatred across the Imperium. But the Necrons did not hear. They did not care. Nurgle, too, grew restless. The Plague Father had long rejoiced in the decay of flesh, the inevitability of entropy, the sweetness of despair. But the Necrons had no flesh. Their bodies did not rot. Their despair had been consumed long ago, traded for silence and eternity. To Nurgle, they were an abomination, immune to his gifts, his caresses. He sent plagues to worlds the Necrons had touched, but they found nothing to infect. The silence choked him, and his garden withered in places, vines curling where no sorrow flowed. Tzench fared no better. The changer of ways thrived on ambition, on schemes, on the tangled webs of fate. But the Necrons had no ambition. They did not hunger for power, did not plot for thrones. Their schemes were not born of desire, but of design, written in protocols older than the stars. Fate itself grew dim where they walked. Tzench's eyes turned to those battlefields and saw nothing. No threads to pull, no lies to whisper, no pawns to play. He hissed in frustration, his plans unraveling in silence. And Slaanesh, youngest of the gods, newly born in agony from the Eldar's fall, found no pleasure in them. The Necrons felt no lust, no joy, no beauty, no pain. To them, existence was function. To Slaanesh, they were voids, unfeeling, untouchable, utterly barren of sensation. They could not be tempted because they had abandoned the very concept of temptation. For the Prince of Excess, it was as if they did not exist at all. The gods roared, but their voices fell into silence. Their daemons howled, but their claws found no purchase. The Necrons were soulless, untouchable, immune. And worse still, their rise starved the warp. Where they marched, psychers went blind. Astropaths screamed and fell silent. The tides of the Imperium faltered. The great game of the gods, the eternal struggle that had defined reality, was threatened by an enemy that played no game at all. The Emperor, watching from his throne, knew this truth as well. The heresy that might have torn his Imperium apart had not yet come, and in this timeline it might never. For Horus could not be tempted if the Necrons burned his fleets to ash before chaos reached him. Lorga's faith would find no purchase if his worlds were erased without trace. Even Magnus's pride, great as it was, could not lead him astray if the warp itself was silenced wherever the Necrons walked. The Chaos gods raged, but they were denied. Their claws scraped against living metal. Their whispers echoed in soulless minds. They could not corrupt what had no soul. And so they turned their fury elsewhere. They lashed out at humanity with greater force, desperate to keep their feast alive. Cults spread like wildfire, possessed of an urgency never seen before. Daemons clawed into real space, trying to carve footholds before the Necrons could silence them. The warp became more violent, more unstable, as the gods fought not only against each other, but against the dying of their fire. But even their fury could not change the truth. The Necrons were not of the warp. They did not feed it. They did not fear it. And for the first time since the Old Ones fell, chaos felt hunger. The Necrons were winning. World after world fell into silence, its cities erased, its people reduced to ash. The Great Crusade no longer expanded, it contracted, shrinking beneath the weight of inevitability. Humanity fought with desperation, the Primarchs carving victories from fire and ruin, but every triumph cost more than it gave. The Eldar withdrew further into the webway, watching the galaxy darken, while the Orcs, for all their ferocity, were ground down to dust. Even chaos itself denied its feast, clawed in frustration at the edges of reality. It was then that whispers of alliance began. The Imperium had never been one to share its power. Humanity was to rule, not bargain. Yet even the Emperor, for all his brilliance, could see that this war could not be won alone. He had studied the Necrons in secret, had seen the scars they left upon the warp, and he knew what the Farseers of the Eldar already understood. Without unity, all would fall. The first alliance was not made on Terra, but on the battlefield. On the world of Draven, a White Scars detachment found themselves cornered, their outriders reduced to scraps of smoking metal, their lines collapsing beneath an endless tide of Necron warriors. Then, from the webway, the Eldar struck. Sleek grav tanks and fire-bright aspect warriors carved into the Necrons' flanks, their weapons singing with energy, designed long ago for this very foe.
The White Scars and Eldar fought side by side without a word spoken, their combined fury breaking the Necron advance. When the battle was done, the Eldar vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only a single rune carved into the scorched earth. We remember. Elsewhere, the Orcs found themselves redirected. Great war bands, roaring into Necron tomb worlds with their usual madness, began to notice something strange. Wherever the greenskins struck, Imperial fleets shadowed them, cutting off retreat, herding them toward greater concentrations of Necrons. The Orcs thought nothing of it. They were happy to fight, to smash, to roar. But the Imperium was using them, steering them like a hammer into the walls of Necron strongholds. Whole Wargars were extinguished in the process, but the Necrons bled too, their endless legions ground down by the only Xenos mad enough to fight them forever. In secret, far stranger bargains were made. A conclave of Eldar Farseers, their souls trembling with the memory of the war in heaven, approached the Emperor directly. Through hidden channels, they sent their message. We cannot win this alone. Even you cannot win this alone. Let us fight beside you, or we shall all fall in silence. The Emperor's reply was curt, but it was not a refusal. Fight where you will, strike where you must. I will not hinder you. For the master of mankind, this was concession enough. And so, a desperate alliance was born, not of trust, not of kinship, but of survival. Eldar war hosts struck in tandem with Astartes, their firepower cutting where humanity could not. Orc warbands thundered into Necron lines, driven unknowingly by Imperial hands. Even the Mechanicum, ever hungry for knowledge, shared forbidden technologies, crafting crude imitations of Necron nullfields. Yet this alliance was fragile. The Eldar did not trust the Imperium, nor the Imperium the Eldar. The Orcs were uncontrollable, their victories as costly as their defeats. And the Emperor's own sons argued among themselves, some furious at the very idea of fighting alongside Xenos. Lemon Russ scoffed at the Eldar's cowardice, Guilliman distrusted their motives, and Dawn wished only to crush them when the war was done. Only Magnus seemed to understand, his voice heavy with grim resignation. We have no choice. This is not about pride. This is about survival. On the battlefield, however, pride mattered little. Together, they began to win. Necron tombs were shattered by combined assaults.
Dynasties that had stood for 60 million years crumbled under the pressure of humanity and Eldar united. For a moment, hope flickered. Perhaps the galaxy could endure. But the Silent King was watching. He saw the alliance for what it was, not a sign of strength, but of weakness. The Imperium was stretching itself too thin, relying on enemies it would never truly trust. The Eldar were bleeding their already dwindling strength. The Orcs were burning themselves out in fire and fury. Even Chaos was starving. The Silent King adjusted his strategy. If unity was the Imperium's last hope, then he would break unity first. He ordered dynasties to strike, not only at worlds, but at trust itself. Imperial fleets found Eldar allies ambushed by Necron fire, only to arrive too late, suspicion gnawing at their bomb, while fought under the same banners. The desperate alliance staggered, but it did not collapse. Not yet. For all their mistrust, for all their pride, none could deny the truth. Alone, they would fall. Together, they could endure. And so the galaxy fought on, a patchwork of enemies bound together by necessity, their banners clashing even as their blades struck the same foe. It was not unity, it was survival. And survival was all they had left. The war never ended. For the Imperium, there would be no final victory, no triumphal march, no banners raised over the ruins of an enemy brought to heel. There would only be survival, bought with blood and fire. And survival was never certain. The Necrons could not be destroyed. Worlds burned, tombs collapsed, monoliths shattered, yet always they returned. A tomb silenced today would stir again tomorrow. A dynasty shattered would reform in silence. The Imperium learned to measure success not in conquest, but in delay. To hold a line for a year was a triumph. To keep a sector alive for a decade was a miracle. The Primarchs, once the bright stars of the Great Crusade, grew dim. Horus, once the War Master, found himself no longer leading a war of expansion, but one of containment. His charisma, once a beacon, now frayed beneath the endless strain. His speeches became darker, his victories more hollow. Guilliman buried himself in logistics, carving bastions across Ultramar, turning every world into a fortress, every fortress into a redoubt. His genius saved millions, but even he knew it was not enough. "We are not building an Imperium," he admitted once. "We are building barricades." Russ fought with savage joy, but the laughter of his wolves turned hollow. Too often, their hunts ended with their prey reforming before their eyes, the thrill of the kill replaced by the despair of futility. Dawn built deeper and deeper, his fortresses sinking into the bones of worlds, but each was eventually undone, each bastion swallowed by silence. Magnus grew distant, his eyes hollow, for the Necrons denied him the warp, and without the warp he was less than himself. Even Ferrus Manus, iron-willed, admitted to his sons that this was a war they could not win. The Empire did not falter, but even his dream dimmed. The Webway project stalled, its resources diverted to war. The Golden Throne remained unfinished, its promise unrealized. Humanity was chained not to destiny, but to attrition. For every step forward, they were dragged 2 steps back. For every colony settled, another burned. The galaxy itself reflected the war. Orcs continued to hurl themselves into Necron lines, their endless wargs, bleeding the machines. But their numbers, vast as they were, dwindled. The Eldar, once proud, grew ever fewer. their craft worlds reduced to shadows of what they had been. Their seers whispered of extinction, of a future where only silence remained. Chaos raged in the warp, but their fury availed them nothing. The Necrons starved them, denied them, ignored them. Cults still festered, demons still clawed into real space, but their strength waned. For the first time since their birth, the gods of the warp knew fear, not of defeat, but of irrelevance. And through it all, the silent king watched. He did not gloat, for he had no joy. He did not mourn, for he had no grief. He simply calculated, adjusted, refined. His dynasties culled and measured, harvested and endured. He did not need to win in a single stroke. Time was his ally. Time was always his ally. Mortals lived and died in breaths. Civilizations rose and fell in hours. The Necrons endured. They had always endured. The galaxy became a tomb, not in an instant, but in degrees. One world silenced, then 10, then 100. One craft world darkened, its infinity circuit snuffed. One orc warg ground to dust. One imperial sector marked as lost. Then another, then another. Survival became narrower, hope thinner. And yet humanity endured. Broken, battered, diminished, but never extinguished. For every world lost, another fought back. For every legion broken, another rose. For every tomb awakened, humanity resisted. They knew they could not win, but they fought anyway.
It was in their nature. The Silent King noted this, and though he did not feel, he understood. Humanity would not go quietly. They would rage, they would bleed, they would claw against inevitability until their last breath. And in that defiance lay their danger. For if they endured long enough, if they survived the crucible, if they outlasted even silence itself, then perhaps one day they would rise again. But that day would not come soon. Not in this age. Not in this galaxy. In this timeline, the Imperium never truly became an empire. It became a fortress, a scar, a wound that bled but never healed. The Great Crusade never fulfilled its promise because it was never allowed to. The dream of unity, of golden destiny, was crushed beneath the weight of inevitability. The grimdark truth of the Necrons' early awakening was this: the galaxy did not burn in fire, nor drown in blood, nor rot in plague. It fell into silence, a silence without end.